In this program, we'll introduce you to the wood lathe. We'll describe all the parts and controls and the different operations that can be done on the lathe. We've included some helpful safety information and a demonstration of two of the most common operations. The modern wood lathe is the latest version of a tool that's been around for hundreds of years. It's used primarily to spin stock for spindle turning and for faceplate turning. They're either floor-mounted or bench-mounted and come in many sizes and power ratings. The wood lathe can even be used for light-duty metal work. The lathe is designed primarily for doing two jobs, spindle and faceplate turning. The lathe can also be set up for boring and drilling and for finish sanding and polishing projects after they've been turned. Some lathes can even be set up for grinding and sharpening tools, for drilling radius holes, and for cutting, fluting, and reeding. In spite of this flexibility, the most common operations in many shops remain the turning and shaping of round stock. The lathe is useful for just about any project where round or disc-shaped stock is required. It's used in furniture and cabinet-making shops to allow designers to get away from common square shapes. In general, wood shop and home shop hobbyists, model builders, and master craftsmen all benefit from the operations made possible on the lathe. It's a pleasure to watch stock evolve from rough stock right into finished shape on a single machine. The lathe can be a very dangerous tool. The stock is often turned at great speed and exposed over most of its surface. Cutter tools can be snagged and thrown when used carelessly. Stock that's not properly centered and secured can also cause serious injury. Proper safety gear must be used at all times, and the tool rest must be carefully positioned for proper operations. We'll cover more on safety later. The main parts of a lathe are the bed, the headstock, the tailstock, and the tool rest. The bed is made of tubular or flat stock and provides a straight and rigid platform on which the other main components are positioned. The headstock assembly is mounted at one end of the bed and is used to support and drive the stock for both faceplate and spindle turning. The spindle is a hollow shaft that turns in a bearing and is rotated by the drive system. Because this spindle turns, it's called a live spindle. It has external threads on both ends for mounting faceplates or screw chucks. Centers are inserted into the hollow end of the spindle for spindle turning. The tailstock supports the other end of the stock during spindle turning and contains its own hollow spindle shaft. This spindle can be moved in and out by adjusting a hand wheel. Locking levers secure both the tailstock and the spindle position. Faceplates have countersunk holes drilled through for mounting stock with wood screws. Screw chucks have a single screw at the center. Live centers have splayed teeth that penetrate into the end of the stock to be turned. Live centers are normally used in the headstock spindle during spindle turning. Cone and cup centers are called dead centers, and they do not rotate. To reduce friction, a drop of oil is placed on the tip of dead centers. Dead centers are normally used in the tailstock. The tool rest is positioned along the bed and swivels and moves up and down so that cutting tools can be carefully positioned in relation to the stock. Floor stands are used for outboard faceplate turning. Locking levers are used to secure the rest in position. Most lathes are driven by a belt and pulley system which is powered by a separate motor. Speed is adjusted through step cone pulleys or expandable pulley systems. Some lathes have an integral motor and are called motorhead lathes. Speeds are selected on these models by switching the motor. The overall size of a lathe is determined by two components. The length of the lathe determines the longest piece of stock that can be mounted for spindle turning. The length is measured from center to center and ranges from a few inches to 50 inches or more. 36 inches is the most common size. The swing is the maximum diameter for stock that can be mounted for spindle turning. The swing is figured by doubling the distance from the center to the bed. Sizes range from around 5 inches to 16 inches. The power of a lathe is determined by the size of the motor. Motors range from 1/2 to 3 horsepower, 1 horsepower being the most common. The speed that a lathe turns the spindle is adjustable, usually ranging from 300 to 3,500 RPM. Some lathes have 3 or 4 speeds. Others are infinitely variable. The basic rule for selecting the proper speed is the larger the piece of stock, the slower the speed. Be sure to check with the operator's manual or the shop supervisor to determine the best speeds for each individual operation. The most common accessories for the lathe are a good set of wood-turning tools. In fact, these aren't really accessories since you can't do any work without them. The gouge, the skew chisel, the parting or cut-off tool, the round nose chisel, these are the basic cutting tools. Keep them sharp. A dull cutting tool is always dangerous to use. Inside and outside calipers are about the only other tools required to get started on the lathe. The lathe is a fairly safe power tool, but serious injury can result if it's used carelessly or if it's set up improperly. Make sure the power is disconnected before setting it up. Avoid loose clothing that might get caught in the machine, and wear proper eye protection. Do not allow anybody to stand near the lathe while you're working. Avoid any distractions that might cause you to lose concentration. Here are a few additional safety rules to keep in mind. Select and prepare stock carefully. Select stock that's free from loose knots, checks, cross-grain splintering, and avoid wood that's improperly glued. Avoid heavy cuts. The corners of large stock should first be trimmed down on another tool such as the jointer or the bandsaw. Check the speed of the lathe. Be sure to select the proper speed for each specific operation. The larger the stock, the slower the speed. All rough work should be done at slow speeds. Check the operator's manual or ask the shop supervisor for help in selecting the proper speed. Handle faceplates and centers carefully. Live centers and faceplates are special tools that should be handled very carefully. Do not drop them or handle them roughly. Be very careful when you remove them so they'll not become damaged. Center the stock properly. Make sure all stock is properly centered before starting the turning operation. Set up the lathe properly. Check to see that the tailstock is locked in position and the 2 centers hold the stock firmly in position. Position the tool rest at the proper height and distance from the work. Before you turn the lathe on, turn it over by hand to make sure the stock clears the tool rest. Never adjust the position of the tool rest when the lathe is turning. Use proper protective gear. A face shield should be worn whenever you're using the lathe unless there's a spindle guard. And even if you are careful and follow all safety precautions, flying debris can be a hazard. Protect your eyes at all times. Keep your hands away from the stock when it's revolving. Never place your hands on the stock while it's in motion. Always hold the cutting tool at the proper angle with a firm grip. Hold the cutting tool with a firm grip and resting against the tool rest. Handle the cutting tools properly. Never leave cutting tools on the bed during or after turning operations. Keep your tools sharp at all times and store them properly so their edges will remain in top shape. Check the dead center and tailstock spindle periodically. Check the dead center often to be sure it's not overheating from friction or lack of lubrication. If it is allowed to get too hot, you'll lose absolute centering. Adjust the spindles so that the stock remains in firm grip between the centers. Use the tool rest at all times except when sanding. Always use the tool rest to support the cutting tool. The only time you should remove it is when you're sanding the stock and your hands are in danger of getting caught between the stock and the rest. Maintain a clean work area. After you're done, remove the stock, put away your cutting tools, and clean up all dust and chips. In this section of the program, we will demonstrate the 2 most common operations on the lathe: spindle and faceplate turning. Start by cutting the stock to approximate size. Allow 1 inch of waste in the length and about a 1/4 inch of waste in diameter. If the stock is 2 inches square or larger, the corners should be cut down on another tool. Make sure the ends are cut square and mark the center of each end. Use intersecting lines drawn from the corners or parallel lines drawn with a marking gauge. Use a back saw and cut one end on the diagonal lines to a depth of 1/8 inch. Center punch the other end at the center mark. Use a drive-out rod to remove the live center from the headstock spindle. Drive the live center into the stock with a wooden mallet. The spurs should enter the kerfs, which were cut with the back saw. Replace the stock and live center into the spindle hole of the headstock. Bring the tailstock to within 1/2 inch of the opposite end of the stock. Tighten the tailstock locking lever and turn the ball crank handle until the point of the dead center enters the wood. If you're using a cup center which does not turn with the wood, be sure to lubricate the end of the center with a drop of oil. Stock between centers should be tightened until you can just turn it by hand. Then turn the hand wheel back about 1/4 turn. Turn the lathe by hand to see that the wood turns easily. Then tighten the tailstock sleeve clamp to hold the spindle in position. Position the tool rest so that the tool will cut at 1/8 inch above the center of the stock and with the rest parallel with the centers. There should be about 1/8 inch of clearance between the rest and the widest part of the stock. Never try to position the tool rest while the lathe is running. When the setup procedures are complete, put on your face shield and turn on the lathe. Make sure the speed is correct for the cutting action and position yourself for applying the cutting tool to the stock. Assume a normal standing position with your feet slightly spread apart. One foot should be slightly ahead of the other, your weight evenly distributed on both feet. Grasp the handle at the end with the right hand and hold the blade end about 1 inch from the cutting edge with the left hand. Place the palm or fingers of the left hand on the tool rest to help guide the tool. Keep your right elbow tucked in. Hold the tool firmly, but don't tense up your body. Slowly roll the cutting edge a little as you lift the handle and begin the cut, moving slowly away from you from the center of the stock towards the right. Make 2 or 3 more cuts and then start working towards the left. The stock should begin to take on a round shape. Begin each successive cut in the rounded area. If you try to start at the ends of the stock where the scrap stock is still square, the tool may be wrenched from your hand. When the stock becomes round and slightly smaller in diameter, turn the lathe off and reposition the tool rest again 1/8 inch from the stock. This is the basic method for turning a cylinder-shaped piece on the lathe. It will take a little practice to develop the skills to use all of the cutting tools and to perform all the cutting operations that are possible in spindle turning. To get ready for faceplate turning, start by preparing the stock. Use a bandsaw to cut the diameter of the stock 1/8 inch larger than finished dimensions. Select a faceplate that is smaller than the disc to be turned. Wood screws are installed through the faceplate to secure the stock. If the screw holes will be objectionable or if there is danger of the cutting tools coming into contact with the screws during the turning, use a spacer block of wood. The block should be about the size of the faceplate and should be glued to the stock with a piece of quality paper sandwiched in between. Don't use paper towels, as these are difficult to get apart later. Screw the faceplate firmly to the base of the stock to be turned or to the glued-up spacer block. Remove the live center from the lathe and screw the faceplate to the spindle. Adjust the tool rest so the cutting tool is cutting above the center and the rest is 1/8 inch away from the stock. Start with a slow speed until the stock is quite round. Be sure to use the right cutting tool for the job to be done. A round-nosed chisel works best for removing large amounts of material. Follow up with a square-nosed chisel to smooth the surface. When the faceplate turning is complete, the faceplate is removed from the block and the finished piece is separated from the block by placing a sharp chisel on the glue joint and giving a light tap with a mallet. To sand projects on the lathe, remove the tool rest so your hands can't get caught between the stock and the rest. For spindle sanding, hold on to each end of the sandpaper strip with your hands and pull the paper toward you and against the stock. For faceplate sanding, hold the sandpaper in one hand and sand on the downward motion. Let's take a minute to review the basic safety rules for operating the lathe. Select and prepare stock carefully. Check the speed of the lathe. Handle faceplates and centers carefully. Center the stock properly. Set up the lathe properly. Use proper protective gear. Keep your hands away from the stock when it's revolving. Always hold the cutting tool at the proper angle with a firm grip. Handle the cutting tools properly. Check the dead center and tailstock spindle periodically. Use the tool rest at all times except when sanding. And maintain a clean work area. There was only enough time in this program to show a couple of the operations that are possible on the lathe. Many more are possible, although it will take considerable practice to make full use of all the possibilities on the lathe. Until next time, remember to have a safe and productive woodworking session.